guys are each coming at AI and this topic from different vantage points. Tell me how do you respond to the question of like what it is and like what gets you excited about some of the work you're doing that we should keep in our minds?
Right. Just a level set, I agree. It is about man and machine. It does not replace the individual. It's about the relationship between the two. So what gets me really excited about it is the efficiency gains and the ability to derive insights from data that people would not have been able to get to before. From sitting there with mountains of research reports that are 100 pages long, and you're looking for the needle in the haystack. Being able to drive to the answer to the question that you asked is pretty impressive, pretty compelling, and really exciting when you think about marketing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that just made me think of there's a methodology and a tool that we've been developing that tries to just pull in a very simple list of thousands of rows of syndicated data and just find the places where the variance is highest, because that's often where the most interesting things to look at are. And that's something that we actually have built on top of a Watson solution, and it can do it in seconds, whereas a person sitting down would take them hours. They would probably only get through a few hundred rows. And it's not to say that then the answer is there in the rows that this tool pulls back, but you still need somebody to look at it. But it's a process that happens a lot faster. And one of the things I like about working in AI is just that it's constantly changing. I mean, there's this funny thing that there's sort of a commonly accepted definition, but there's not really an official definition of what AI is. And one of the best things that I've heard, and this was said years ago, is it's what computers can't do until they can, and that is constantly changing every day. So there's things that we see. Google Maps would definitely be considered artificial intelligence, a number of years ago. You saw it, right? But that's not something that we necessarily think of in that way.
So one of the things that we all, and probably in this room, spend a lot of time is really trying to know our customer and our audience, and that, Jodie, I believe is really at the heart of what your mission in life is. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the ways that this topic applies and some of the things you're observing.
So with our solution, and one of the problems that we solve in the marketplace is one around scenario generation, right? And I'll break that down and unpack it a little bit, and predictive modeling when it comes to media strategy, right? So imagine yourself as a media strategist, and you're trying to think about how do I optimize the placement of my media, either by tactic, by zip code, by channel. How do you begin to look at all of those KPIs that somewhat compete with each other and make optimal decisions? So we use artificial intelligence and Pareto optimality to help us solve that problem. We also begin to take it a step further to look at, if I make that decision, what are my outcomes going to be? So it clears, the deck for the strategist from doing all of the heavy grunt work, because now they can look at these decisions at scale across the organization and really find efficiencies. That's from a media perspective. The other thing that I find really fascinating, similar to what James had said, is how you use personality when getting towards one-on-one personalization when it comes to marketing. So typically, a lot of marketers, and can't speak for everybody in the room, but from my understanding, there's a lot of looking at people, what people have done in the past, or looking at demographics that ultimately drive how people look at a campaign. So if you want to reach me, you might look at how many kids I have, I live in suburbia, what type of car I have, and things like that. But we use personality as an indicator to augment what people are doing around demographics and other factors, to say, if I can market to Jodie Sasse based upon her personality, then I can begin to message to her at the core what really makes her tick. I can understand from social media the types of words that somebody like Jodie Sasse uses. I can understand from Instagram the type of pictures, the colors, the visuals that she's using them. And then I can repurpose those ideas and concepts in my copy so I can ensure that what I'm creating resonates with her.
So, Jodie, it sounds like from your vantage point, the way it's like AI is being used is really like almost like an expert assist.
Yes.
Like you have marketing experts who are using it to like do what they do, make it easier, more refined, or better. And I think, James, you're coming at sometimes from a slightly different vantage point where you might be developing AI apps that are actually consumed by consumers or that sort of vantage point versus Jodie's model, which is like helping marketers do their jobs.
Yeah, I think that that's true. What I would say is that, to get back to, we were talking about this actually before, that I think one of the things that's tough about AI is because it is emerging and because there's a lot of misconceptions around it, and it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around how you would actually apply it. It leads to thinking that if you're going to use AI, then you have to create something that's about AI versus looking at it as a tool in the toolbox of possible ways that you can approach a problem. And we've had lots of experiences where someone comes in and we'll do a workshop over the course of a day or 2 days with clients and put stickies all over the wall and try to assemble a really cross-functional team from the organization, all with the aim of, well, we're going to use AI to solve this problem. And in the end, we might come up with something that doesn't need AI, and that's fine. So I think that's definitely something, to like how do you get started, which we can talk more about later. It doesn't have to be all about AI. It's a layer. In the same way, if you look back in the industry 20 years, it was like everything was about digital, and then it was mobile, and then it was social, and then it was the Internet of Things, and now it's AI. It's like, well, none of those things went away. They've all just kind of become layers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that certainly mirrors what we're seeing too. Would you say though that there's a sort of a bit of a pattern emerging though around some of the use cases that you see most frequently that you do end up pulling AI into?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I feel like chatbots and voice interfaces are ways that the general public is starting to understand artificial intelligence. I think natural language understanding, and that's like something that we understand innately as humans, as something that we do already. It's like, okay, well, a computer does that too. It's not necessarily this magical thing that works better than we do or something. So I think we see that a lot. I'm starting to see a little less on the chat bot side, more on the voice interface side, more on the kind of spoken assistant. So the Alexas, the Google Homes, Google Assistant kinds of things. And I have a lot of feelings about why the chat thing has maybe not happened and exploded in the way that everybody, some people, including me, believe it's going to happen. I've changed my mind about it. But that's kind of a rabbit hole, so.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, playing off that, what are some of the misperceptions that we are encountering that you all may be encountering on a daily basis?
I think, and I'll speak from my experiences at IBM and equals 3, you get a lot of people challenging, well, it's not ready for prime time. I think AI is interesting, and as James said, it's an evolution, we're on a journey, and we're at the early stages of that journey. But I think, one of my lessons learned is really not to force fit AI to being a solution to a problem. It's not a solution looking for a problem. You have your problem that you're trying to solve, and there's a series of different technologies, analytics technologies, AI, that can solve that problem. The question is, what is the right fit for solving the problem that you're looking to address? That's one of the biggest challenges that I see in the industry, which drives some of the misconceptions that it's not ready that it's not ready for prime time.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think also, artificial intelligence as a concept has been around for quite a long time, even though I would say we are really at the beginning of the journey still. But a lot of things like science fiction have confused the idea of artificial intelligence with like artificial consciousness. And those things are not the same, and there's nothing happening out there. I mean, Jan LeCun, who leads AI research at Facebook, we can talk about Facebook too at some point. He's still brilliant, this guy. He thinks we're probably like 30 years away from what's called artificial general intelligence, and that's that's where you start to see kind of a system that can adapt and kind of move from topic to topic and task to task the way that a human or a living being can. We're still at a point where most of what AI is a very narrow, specific thing that various services can do well, that when put together by a human in the right way can sort of give this illusion of something that is smart. And but my favorite engineer that I have ever worked with in my life always told me that software is stupid, and I think that is still true. If you don't tell it what to do, it isn't going to do it.
Well, that's actually an interesting point, James. Maybe you could tell us a little bit. I know you've been working on a couple of different projects where, just take a chatbot, for instance, how that training, you have to train, the chatbot doesn't come smart in knowing a brand or the kinds of questions the customer would ask. Tell us a little bit about how that training process works.
Yeah, there's a lot of, every day that the answer to that question I think changes, because we see more and more solutions built on top of solutions that make these things really easy to build too. I mean, there are services where you can have a natural language chatbot, up in a few hours, or something that at least answers frequently asked questions or something like that. A lot of those are built on top of very powerful Watson services. So yeah, that training process, I would urge anyone who's thinking about doing this. You don't want to build something really from scratch. I mean, unless you're planning on making this like a core piece of your business, which I would urge you not to do as your first foray into this. You're going to want to find a smart developer who understands the stuff and is going to help you choose the right solution that works for you to build on top of. But that training process has gotten as simple as, in many cases, saying, well, here's 5 different ways I can imagine someone asking this question, and you type them all in there, and that kind of churns for a few minutes, and then you've got something that can understand a whole bunch of other ways that question could be asked that you didn't think of. And that's kind of the magic of these systems.
And what you're hitting on is the idea that these are like systems that are learning. Like they're learning, which is different than just like automatically programming some of the stuff in that you might have done in the past with like more hard-coded traditional computing systems. But there's probably other implications for working with systems that learn too. Jodie, you may have some observations on that.
Yeah, I think in addition to the learning element that James mentioned, I think it's really important for these systems to be experts in a domain, right? Because these systems today are not going to compete with Wikipedia, right? Which has been built over time. There is a domain-to-domain adaptation that needs to take place for learning systems. So what you might teach a system in finance when you're talking about, let's say, I'm just thinking spend, right? It could be facility spend. But if I'm in marketing, I talk about spend, and the domain of marketing is going to pick up that spend. I'm most likely talking about media or campaign spend, something very different. So it's really important that when you train these systems, that the domain helps in underpinning the context of the language.
We even saw that, Jodie, when we were working with like Memorial Sloan Kettering.
Yep.
There are, I think, 15 different definitions of cancer, and so the system had to learn the nuances of each of those to be able to reply and understand the question appropriately. So along those same lines, I mean, there's probably some different skills that are involved in sort of working with the systems too. It's not like you flip it on and go. If you're constantly working with a system that learns, it requires a different kind of like sort of organizational approach to working with it. What are we hearing there?
Yeah, I think from my experiences, and this is a question of, do I build it or do I buy it, right? First of all, if you are buying it, the most important skills are really the domain skills, an individual in the organization that understands the type of questions that people are asking of the content that you have, right? As James mentioned, that's part of the training process that if I can understand intents and utterances of
What's an intent?
an intent, so if I ask a question, that is how you begin to blow out, I asked this question and
So like, where are the
five or
restrooms?
10 questions that are similar to that.
Mhm.
Right? You need a domain expert to help you understand that, because ultimately you're transferring, capabilities of the human that does that cognitively
Right.
to that of a system and training the system to do it on its own.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts I have on this, which is that I think it's a little bit the build buy thing. If you are in a situation where you are working with a team of experts who are, deep in computer science and machine learning and building a system from scratch, that, as the system learns over time and you continue to train it, and it's going to get better, but there's a fair amount of upkeep associated with that process. One of the benefits of working with a provider, like an IBM or a Google or Amazon or these companies that are offering these services that are AI services that are APIs. And for anyone who's not familiar with what that is, a great analogy of an API is like the waiter in a restaurant. So I say, I want a burger. The waiter says, great, disappears, comes back, says, here's your burger. A lot of things happened that I didn't need to know about, where the burger got made and all the other people who were involved and all that stuff, but ultimately I got what I was asking for. So an API is just simply that. Here's some data, give me back something. It could be a confidence score about something. It could be a series of comma-separated values of what the system thinks is in a photo. I'm gonna wait for this. Thanks. So one of the benefits of that is that let's say I'm building something and I'm going to use an image recognition service from Watson, and I'm going to use a translation service from Google, and I'm going to put those things together in some way to build some cool experience or product or analytics tool. The benefit to me is that I'm not actually going to continue to necessarily train that system to get better at recognizing objects in photos or translating one language to another, because there's a huge group of people at those respective companies working on improving those services, and as the consumer of that API, I'm benefiting from all of the improvements that go along with it. So over time, those translations will get better. The ability of the system to tell me what's in those images will get better just automatically, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I was catching up with a client the other day, and they happened to be running a pretty well advanced chatbot. This is just one example from like many that they could apply, but they were saying that they have had to sort of think about their skill set of experts to help maintain that a little bit differently. And they recently hired a creative writing undergraduate student, just graduated, to be sort of the writer for the chatbot, and the new employee was just thought, I never dreamed I'd be working at a company managing AI in this capacity, but she's literally helping inform the intents and the responses that are consistent with the brand and giving some voice to that. And I was curious if either of you are seeing sort of maybe some new skills from a marketing perspective that are emerging in some of the projects that you're working on.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the terms I've heard thrown around recently is conversational copywriter, which is more for kind of these voice interfaces and chatbots and things. I mean, not to say that we've hired someone directly for that, but I think what we are seeing is, rather than pulling in, like the writers that would have been working on, say, website copy, we're pulling in the people who like work in our studio and work on scripts and stuff like that, because that's more voice, right? So I think there's definitely that. Also, I think as the toolkit grows of all of these different technologies and the associated ways that people interact with these technologies, we're seeing a little bit more of the line blur between like the user experience people and some of the developers. which is kind of like the unicorn thing that you're always looking for, I think, in talent. But we're starting to actually see more of that, like people who have a really deep understanding of user experience, but have at least enough understanding of how to like work with some of the technical tools that they can almost like build something that kind of works on their own. It's not to say that that's necessarily the thing that like we go and build into production code, but it's kind of like enough to show to somebody, figure out whether something works, and vice versa. So
I think that almost taps into the need for cross-functional teams, right? It's not just about the developer to string together a series of APIs. It's about having the developer aligned to the business, and then, pulling in folks that can understand, well, how do I engage the consumer, whether it's an internal user, whether it's an external user, in the application that I'm ultimately building out. Because these APIs, as James mentioned, they're building blocks, right? They don't solve problems unless you string them together.
Well, I think you're hitting on something, Jodie, that like for organizations who go down the route of like building their own AI application, it's not just, what I've observed, it's not just like, oh, the customer care team is doing a project. They actually are forced, but they need to work with all the different parts of their business to make it work really well.
yeah, I mean, so one of the things that the ways we approach this usually is we start with a workshop, and we feel very strongly about having some sort of cross-functional representation from the client organization at that workshop. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the most important ones is that it forces a group of people to have a conversation about what this is before we start doing anything with it. We've seen, half of these things, half the time it doesn't work, it's because we, get together with a group and we have one like business unit in the room, and we'll bring together a cross-functional team from our side, have a great conversation, come up with a bunch of great ideas, scope it, get ready to go, and then we, have to ask a question of like the ops team, and the answer is like, no, we don't have time to do that, and that's kind of the end of it. Whereas if there was one person from the ops team who was in that room, has shared ownership over the ideas and why we're doing this, and feels some ownership really for what we're doing, it changes everything.
And I think that, your comment about the cross-functional team also begins to lend itself to, is AI going to solve this problem? Is it analytics, right? That's all fleshed out in those workshops. I know we as Equals3 did a similar workshop with IBM early on in our journey, on the cognitive journey. I know that Havas does these every single day around cognitive. So it's an interesting way of approaching, how do I solve these business problems, getting those cross-functional teams together and thinking through, that journey and how to map these things out together.
Well, speaking of hot topics and questions that come up, I know lately, in particular, the biggest question has been around privacy and security. So, how does that fit into this conversation? Obviously, it's come up a lot lately with some of the Facebook considerations and things like that. But I know one of the questions I often get asked is, well, if I'm training using my data, do all of my competitors get access to that? Does it just go into the cloud somewhere? Like, how is that playing into some of the work you're seeing?
I think there's two levels of that. There's privacy and security from an application perspective, but then there's also privacy and security from an infrastructure perspective. From an application perspective, we at Equals3, we ensure that all of our clients that we engage with, their data, whether it's first party or third party, is kept very separate from other clients' data, whether a competitor or whether somebody in a totally adjacent industry. That's important to us. I know from an IBM perspective, not sharing broadly in the open and having everybody's contributions coming together to train the models is something that they pride themselves on, that it's somewhat your data is yours. We're not benefiting from it more broadly from an AI perspective.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the application level, I think you're gonna want to, again, you know, we wouldn't recommend probably starting from scratch and being like, I'm gonna build this secure private system. There's a bunch of wonderful, you know, companies out there that will do that for you for a small monthly fee. So I would start there. It'll be really interesting to hear what happens in the EU with GDPR in the coming months. I mean, that, you know, in the weird way that I feel like here, we're kind of like, I mean, they're ahead of, it's a lot. Like GDPR is very intense, and I think like there's a lot of companies that are gonna have a lot of trouble complying with that, and concerns around whether they're gonna be able to like effectively market in the way that they're used to. And there's this funny thing here, which is like we totally lack regulation in that space in a lot of ways, but then you look at things like HIPAA in healthcare, which is like this kind of antiquated way of thinking about separating data that leads to a lot of problems and inability to innovate in that space, I think, in many ways. So we've kind of like missed it in both directions. Yeah, I mean, that is gonna be, I think that the Facebook thing is just an example of, I think, like, people are gonna start asking more questions and people are never gonna read fine print, and the reality is that I think if we want to be ethical and transparent about what we're doing, that isn't gonna work super well anymore, and we're gonna have to be more like in people's face about what we're doing. We try to maintain that.
Too long.
I know. We try to, whenever we're working on like an experience, we try to, like, one, don't you take data or use data that you don't need. And I think that's always a challenge, right? Because we never know what we might need in the future, and we think, well, let's just take all of it, whatever they'll give us. So try not to do that. But yeah, the ethical framework around this stuff is it's going to be hard to put something together. There are a few, you know, popping up. There's a few like groups that are starting to think about this stuff and put together frameworks, and it'll be interesting to see what takes hold there, because it's not going to fix itself, and I don't think that the government is going to fix it, really.
Yeah, it will be really, and I mean, I guess on that topic, I mean, certainly GDPR is going to be front and center for many of us in many different facets. What else should the folks here keep in mind around how AI is taking shape and what we see coming, say, in the next 6 to 12 months? What are the things to keep in mind?
So 6 to 12 months, you know, I think we're going to see movement from chatbot to more conversational, guided conversation. So chatbot's more question and answer. I think as we move to guided conversation, it's how do you begin to guide a user down a certain path. I think we're going to see additionally, you know, benefits in the learning space and domain adaptation.
So
which help,
faster training in a specific
help
area.
Clients, you know, begin to adopt these technologies on a more rapid basis. I think that's been a lot of the struggles that I know we at IBM saw.
Right.
Was how quickly can I get the solution in? How long does that learning process take? So I know, you know, that's a focus for a lot of companies, not just IBM.
So the AI is getting better, and it'll help speed that up.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit. I think the chat thing to more conversational as a support for other things. I think, like what I was saying earlier, this thought that I had, and I can't take complete credit for it because it's based on something that I read recently, is that there was this conflation of the vast rise in messaging networks where no one's downloading apps anymore, and everyone's on, you know, WhatsApp, and everybody's doing this, right? So chatbots are going to take over the world, and everything is going to be chat. But we're not really there yet, and part of the reason you like to converse with people on networks is that you can code switch and context switch and jump from one thing to the other, and it's not confusing. It's never, you know, you don't misunderstand one another. And we're not really there yet, and most of the time there's other content that we need that is not just text to have a great experience with, like a brand or a company. So whereas the voice thing, I think there's a more natural it's a layer more natural to speak than it is to type
Is that
with
what
your
I was
thumbs.
yelling, agent?
Agent. James, do you have an example just for the audience about what you mean by the voice interaction, like how that is evolving or changing?
How it's changing. I mean, I think it's you're seeing everyone, especially within Alexa, you're seeing like everybody jumping in there and everybody wants a skill. One of the challenges that we have with our clients is reminding them that a skill on a platform like that is not a campaign, it's not a stunt, it's something that kind of has to provide some level of utility if you want people to use it more than once, and if people install it and never use it again, that doesn't really reflect great on you, and Amazon's not happy about it either. So it's really, not everybody needs one of those things, but everybody certainly wants one.
Well, but do they ever feel like, do some of these brands ever feel disintermediated because their brand is being experienced through this other brand, essentially?
That's interesting. I'm not. I suppose so. I mean, we're starting to see a little bit more within. This is happening with all kinds of speech frameworks. Is an ability to sort of like adjust the speech in some way and add more emphasis in different areas, and change things like tone and which I think helps. Because you can infuse a little bit more of a voice into there. But I haven't. I mean, I've definitely seen like brands who want to like record a voiceover as their skill or their voice thing, which doesn't work great yet. Although I think we're honestly probably months away from. There are companies out there that are doing amazing things where you can go in a room and record yourself saying 300 sentences and then synthesize anything you want. You might have seen recently some video synthesis that has been going around as well. These like crazy things that are possible, from small amounts of data to extrapolate that into entire voices or characters and stuff. And so we're not far from that.
Well, I think that you're touching on something big, which is like, as the AI improves, it can be trained on these pretty small data sets, which does open a lot of different possibilities. Well, we could probably talk for a long time up here, but we'd love to hear questions that you all might have. So ask away. Yes.
When you talk about AI systems learning and
Great question. I mean, I can talk a little bit about this. What we've seen some of our clients do is at a minimum, like if you think of the average contact center, they have conversations happening with agents, like perhaps in the tens of thousands a day. So they are using AI in some cases to listen or read the transcripts of those conversations and look for certain themes. So they can see within a couple moments, like if there's something that happens with, I don't know, a store or a website, they can see all of a sudden there's a huge uptick because maybe a product is out of stock, and they can make some really quick adjustments, where in the past it would have taken longer to react to something like that because they couldn't read and understand the types of conversations that were happening real time.
so why would someone why would someone choose that option versus choosing the option where you get a group of subject experts in a room and some creative copywriters in the room and train the AI system or the chatbot to react that way?
Well, in some cases they're doing both, I would say. So if it's, I would say that there's probably nuances in sort of reading all those transcripts that would make help you make certain decisions versus we have this one client who is using the chatbot to respond to some of those questions. I think what they're learning real time is when the way that chatbots work now is, let's say that I ask a question that the chatbot might not know the answer to. It has to transfer that conversation to sometimes an agent who's working behind the scenes and responding. And one of our clients found that when they were transferring it to an agent, the person would get annoyed because they found the chatbot was actually better at responding. So they had to, there's just all these real-time things that they have to figure out in terms of the kind of expectations that they thought, you'd always want the human, but sometimes people just really want a chatbot. They just would prefer the speed for certain things that are just updating an address, or, you know, it just depends.
But is the chatbot transferring them to an agent at random, or to
That's another great question.
a super agent, right?
So that we've seen more and more people using chatbots where the AI can read the context of the conversation and then switch them to an agent who might have more expertise in that specific area, rather than just like somebody at random. So it knows the kinds of questions that are coming out.
How's that training work?
It reads the transcript of the chat, and then it looks for keywords, and you train it to understand, oh, if this is a question about how to, you know, fix my carburetor or something, you know, James is the expert there, and I'm gonna switch him over to his queue.
Two quick follow-ups to that, just some real world other examples, is that we've found that even though these systems, like for instance, if we throw some text that you typed onto a website at the chatbot, it knows what it's going to respond in fractions of a second. It is usually a good idea, we have found, to make that artificially longer, almost as though the system is kind of thinking, and that the idea that it took them, you know, a couple seconds to figure out how to answer their question seems to play better. And also in a situation where you are transferring that to a real person, you're no longer trying to catch up, where all of a sudden you were getting these immediate responses, and then maybe it's taking a while. And we did work on a chatbot for a pharmaceutical client. And we did some testing because there was concern around the target for this particular drug, that they would not be interested in interacting with a chatbot. And we did some very lightweight testing, kind of in a focus group setting, one-on-one, but everyone was pleasantly surprised to find out that it was not a real person. So
It might ask questions of the chatbot that they would not feel comfortable asking.
yeah, as soon as they realized it was a bot, which, and another sort of design principle that we try to, if it is a bot, we try to make that actually pretty clear up front, so that you're not trying to fool someone into thinking that they're speaking with a human, and then maybe later on they say, wait a minute, is this a machine? But people were pleasantly surprised to find out that it was not.
I also imagine as folks are rolling out chatbots in, say, client service, they use it internally first in order to train the chatbot to understand the questions that people are asking, so almost like an agent assist module. And then they take that chatbot and expose it externally after it's been trained from all of the interaction with user assist. And then the agents, you know, again, this is a combination of man-machine, not a replacement strategy, then they're able to answer the more complex systems that maybe the 20% that the chatbot can handle.
Yes.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about business applications. So, I mean, the conversation is interesting, I kind of get that, and kind of optimize it for the human experience. Answering the question. But, you know, I'm thinking more of an analytic kind of process where, okay, say I'm optimizing a system to make a recommendations. Okay, and we've all seen them, we've seen Amazon do it, I guess pretty well, it works for them. But how intelligent are these systems? I mean, you know, if I give it an objective function of saying, okay, I want you to sell one more product to every customer and just put something in the shopping cart. That's one objective function. Suppose, you know, I'm going for lifetime value, or I'm trying to move something different. I mean, how intelligent are these systems, and how do you go about training those? You know, how do I find those tools? How do I string those together?
Well, I mean, I can give you an example of, we work with this energy company in Australia, and every time they build an oil rig, it costs like $1 billion. So it's a pretty big investment. And what they found was they had all these engineers, and they had all these systems of knowledge management, but they were, their engineers were spending a lot of time trying to figure out, oh my gosh, is this decision been made before, or has this engineering problem been addressed before? Meanwhile, they're having a bunch of their engineers retire or move out of the company. So they took, they used AI to have it read like all the different reports and documentation that they've done. So now what they found is you can actually just ask the system like, I'm trying to prevent birds from flying into the rudders of this plane. How do I solve for that? And it comes back with a few different ways and things to think about that, where in the past, they wouldn't have been able to sort of make those decisions in a way that was based on the sort of institutional knowledge of, many people. So that's one example. I mean, I'm not sure if that's like getting at what you're
Well, I'm
asking.
I'm trying to solve for something too, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a question where you're asking that somewhat sits between AI and predictive, right?
Yeah.
So, and when I was at IBM, we used to have clients coming to us all the time with problems that were truly predictive modeling type of problems that they wanted AI to solve. And IBM obviously has a big bag of tricks in that area. So we're like, you know what? Go speak to our friends over there because I think you're gonna get the solution that you're looking for. For us, we're leveraging a technology from IBM called Trade-off Analytics, which leverages Pareto optimality. And we built our own predictive modeling capability on top of that in order to do optimization, right? So when I think about trade-off analytics and the capabilities that it has, we used to always give examples. Well, think about when you're buying a house, right? You think about how close you are to a train station. How are the schools? What is the crime rate? What is the population? You got a lot of competing alternatives there, and how do I make the best decision based upon a sliding of scales on each and every one of them to find my ideal house? So that's where I think there's
See,
some.
that sounds like a marketing problem, right?
It could be education, right? How do
No,
I
I
pick,
understand,
right?
I understand.
Yes.
Yeah, but where there's 15 or 20 variables that
Yep.
are all sort of, and so it isn't just as simple as doing a regression analysis on whether somebody bought the last
Correct.
time they got a piece of mail or email or whatever it is. It's more like, where are they in their lives? Where
Right.
are they? What's their bank account look like? There's a million different things. And are those kinds of problems, are those AI problems now, or am I totally still back in the predictability?
Some of them could be AI problems as you look at making optimal decisions. I know we're looking at that as an AI problem.
I mean, particularly because, what the first sort of scenario that comes to mind is just AI can be used to sort of read and understand the content, like, not just like search for stuff, understand the context and meaning across a lot of different information, a lot of unstructured, which is like probably the biggest part that I would think AI, one of the biggest areas that AI could help. But it probably, like you were saying, Jodie, would be combined with analytics and things like that.
And I think you may need to be okay not necessarily knowing exactly what the driver was that led you to that solution, depending on, because you could build, if you knew you had a particular outcome that you wanted to get to, you could say, well, here are all my inputs, and I'm going to create this system to optimize for this one particular thing. And maybe it's I want an uptick in 5% over here. Okay, you build this model and you run it. Here's the answer. Here's how you need to take all your inputs. You're going to do it this way. Great. Well, which of these inputs is really driving that 5%? What if I want to make it 6%? A lot of times, if you're going to use like traditional data science to solve that problem, you kind of have to start over. It's a new problem. You're giving it a new problem. It's not, well, I just want to move it up 1%. It's literally an entirely different problem because you're not going to get back the interrelations of the inputs from the answer. But I think that's where we're starting to see systems that are a little bit more fluid in that way. But traditionally, it's one of the knocks that AI gets is this like black box problem of, well, now I don't know how the problem was solved, and that's especially causing a lot of controversy in medical field where, you know, you can say, what should I do with this patient? And it tells you the answer. And what if it's wrong? And we can't know why it was wrong.
Would you consider an auction-based, advertising, optimization system? Is that AI in your world?
Definitely was at one point. I don't know if I'd call it that.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Sam?
I'm curious about sort of how the maturity or sophistication of a marketing practice plays into the use of AI. And it might depend on the use case, but what Jodie was saying before about using personality and observing what sorts of images you respond to, types of words or text or tonality. If a client is interested in saying, oh, we'd love to do that, but they don't have the ability to create all those versions of content or deploy them or locate their audiences on all these different devices in order to deliver the message. It kind of is useless, but so is there a base level of sort of requirement, or is it scaling back in use cases on the AI side, or how do you sort of balance that?
That's a good question. So we typically focus on Fortune 1000 and the agencies that serve Fortune 1000. And the rationale is, it's not really a budget rationale, it is the amount of content that they have that they're struggling with. Because this is a content challenge for Fortune 1000. So if you look at their research use case, they've got tons of subscriptions. They've got agencies that support them. They have data coming at them from so many different sources, they don't even know where it's coming from. Same thing with, the audiences as well as the media mix modeling piece. They could be working with an agency, maybe they want a little bit more transparency, but it's usually clients of that level. At this point in time for us, that are really good consumers of our solution set. Doesn't mean that AI can't solve problems for a smaller set, because IBM has, an open platform where developers can come in and, string together APIs to solve a specific problem. It's just, what is the magnitude of the problem that you are looking at, and then what's the best entry point based upon, where you are in your development as an organization.
But to your point about customizing the content, I met with a smaller startup the other day who was using some of the natural language understanding to understand the tone, and then actually he was a creative director on the side, and he developed an algorithm on you to customize the content. So I think that could be an area that actually might be emerging to sort of open up the field to apply some of that, because it is a legitimate question, how would you ever sort of customize some of the content or create it appropriately?
So I'm kind of fascinated by the whole, as you were saying, Sam, the ability to read colors socially and sort of put these seemingly disparate pieces of data together. Are there separate tools that do this for separate pieces of data, and then is there a sandbox that you all play in before it goes into that AI type of read? How does that all work?
You want to take your first
No,
step
go
on
for it.
the Lumix piece?
Oh, well, sure. So behind the scenes, whether it's Google or Facebook or anybody who's creating AI, it's really different pieces of the code that James described. So there's these different APIs that you can call, one for vision, one for speech, they have it all sort of broken out. And then you can combine them together. And then there is an ability to test it and things like that. But the idea is that there's sort of these basic building blocks that you can mush together. And then that's where organizations like Jodie's come into play, that you put them together in a logical way.
Them together to solve specific business problems. But, there are tons of provider of AI technologies out there in the marketplace. We lean towards IBM's technology, given the security and the privacy piece, given the breadth, given the R&D into the technology. But again, we use IBM's cloud platform for AI. We host on IBM's cloud platform. And before anything is ever put into market, there is obviously a sandbox that gets, a lot of testing.
said it.
Yes.
Kind of interested, yesterday I saw an article by Jeff Weiner at LinkedIn that was talking about skill gaps. I'm on the south side right now. And he was talking about, a lot of people thought it was software engineering. Number one skill gap is communication skills, human to human. I guess to take a leap in that direction, you guys have done a great job explaining it to me and this group. How do you see the information that's being input into the AI and people who are on the other side of the phone benefiting from AI, being willing to take those variables that you talked about and take educated risks in talking to a human being who may be persuasive and bringing them in another direction? How do you foresee that challenge? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm thinking, it's a good question.
Trying to overcome objections that a machine may be giving a human on the other side of the phone.
Do you have a thought on that, James?
So in like a practical way, do we mean maybe like in a sales
Yeah.
situation, I'm getting data back from a machine that's
Yeah,
telling
I came
me
across it yesterday.
to do a particular thing that I don't agree with, or that I want to go a different direction, and how do we?
Yeah, came up yesterday on the phone where I recommended some different custom data sets to a client. So, but we have AI, and it's telling us this. And after about 2 or 3 times of them saying that, I felt like I was in Spinal Tap. We got 11. How do we? Any suggestions on where we're going with the communication gap?
I don't know. I mean, I think I am not of the mind that we kind of started the conversation here that any of this is going to replace humans. I think we're going to see a lot more, hopefully, agreement. I hope in some of those scary stories about like what does this mean for humanity, and because I don't actually think it's going to be. We're still going to need people to do pretty much everything. This sounds more like a kind of a cultural or like a depends what kind of company you work for. I mean, I think it sounds like you're doing the right thing. Don't listen to the machine.
LinkedIn is a pretty valid company in terms of understanding the working environment, right? So if they're getting their research and we need to understand how to interact with the information that you're garnering, it's a very valid question because as people who have experience, that's valuable to marketers. And at the same time, you have people who may not be that experienced, not willing to take risk beyond the comfort level of the machine.
Yeah.
So,
I think it is a good question. I feel unqualified to answer, to be honest.
yeah.
Yeah.
So trying to
Yeah,
deal
I
with it.
think that's going to be an interesting dilemma because there is something to say for actually having gone through the steps to actually learn that information as an individual, so you can then impose judgment. Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? And I actually had this conversation with somebody who's an attorney for a very large insurance company the other day, and they were implementing AI to help with the contracts process. And he's like, but there's something to say for these new folks coming in that they've never done the grunt work. I don't know the answer to that question, but it is going to be an interesting challenge not to have people go through the ranks and actually have the experience themselves.
Or even, it's not always safe to assume that the AI models themselves don't have bias built into them. That's something else that we have a big team, from researchers looking at, like how do you remove bias from some of these models? It can creep in very easily without us,
I would urge everyone to look at the MIT project Moral Machine if you've never seen it, which is it's an exercise that puts you making the decisions for self-driving cars about there's pedestrians, there's different races, there's it's terrible, and but it's very telling of where we are.
What was that again?
Moral Machine, it's called.
Thanks, that was very helpful.
I have a question. So a lot of what Alliant does in building out, solutions and for audience targeting, more programmatic, YouTube off the shelf, with custom audiences. But I've often felt like seeing in the marketplace what's lacking is, yes, you're targeting display or video to specific audiences. The creative, there seems to be a lag in the creative being customized for the particular audiences, right, and the offers in those creatives. So I've seen some companies coming out with sort of like a programmatic approach to pulling creative together based upon the signals, whether it's just the digital behaviors or the actual audience that they're targeting. And I could see that maybe an AI application with that, because you talk about colors and being able to maybe string together what someone, I guess how they, the photos, Instagram, the colors, et cetera, Facebook, and whatever else you might capture about that. I mean, anything that you're working on there with the agencies that you
I'm not working on anything like that specifically, but I mean, as Betsy was saying earlier, there are companies that are doing this kind of dynamic creative creation where you see it's you throw in, here's a bunch of lines, here's a bunch of images, here's 2 creative executions that look the way I want them to look, make all the rest of them, in all the sizes, and it's fast, and they're getting pretty good. I mean, this is all the creative people are worried about this now, but so that exists. It probably doesn't meet the overall concern of really getting quality stuff in front of everyone that is truly personalized.
Right.
But that's where pulling in, even other data points around location, we see, great executions of using the weather, or that could be down to the minute about whether it's raining or not, or how cold is it, that makes it feel really alive and cool, and that can help add a layer to it.
We actually have an alpha solution that we're building out that does just that. We're going to start with the text piece of it, the language piece of it, and then we're going to move to the images piece of it. But we do have an alpha product, and I know IBM had a product a few years back called Message Resonance that did just that. I know, yeah, it was pretty good.
Yeah, I was at a contact center convention last week, and there was a lot of optimism about using AI for call centers, especially for travel and entertainment type clients, a lot of consumer calls. Is that something that you're seeing, that contact centers are kind of an early adopter?
Totally. I mean, particularly like what you said in the chatbot space for answering some of the very basic questions, but we're also have a bunch of clients who use it where if you call your agent who might have to answer a really complicated or tough question, is that behind the scenes using a chatbot that's been trained on really complex things. So for example, we work with this big bank in Brazil who had just acquired a bunch of different banks, and they had 100 different products or something that were always changing. So they found that they had hold times of 10 or 12 minutes because I would have to ask Jodie and James, answer this question. And then they trained it on these, very nuanced things, and it was able to really cut it down. But then I think also just applying standard, consumer-based chatbots is, something we're seeing a lot of.
Yeah, I think for the transactional stuff, it's really helpful. I think within hospitality, there's such an importance to kind of that human touch or the white glove service and all that technology is going to struggle to provide. There've been a few funny, Hilton had a robot for a while that was checking people in, and there are places in Scandinavia where you can check into a hotel and never see anyone. There's no staff and it's all electronic, and I don't know that that's going to excite people for a long time.
But I do see it in the contact center space as really being a driver to take out time and to improve the metrics within a contact center because, you know, ultimately, again, it's the same problem that, you know, we were speaking about earlier. You get too much data that a contact center agent needs to go through. And it might be sitting in a repository, it might be sitting in a manual from someplace. Again, they either have to know where it is, or they have to have a really slick system inside to help them find and navigate that information.
Or like even things like Jodie, was one of our clients was saying how when they started using their chatbot, they realized that you know, that never turns off, so it started running 24/7. So they realized that most of the people were using it on nights and weekends when their contact center was down.
Yeah.
So that helped.
Yeah, and where I personally have seen chatbots in travel and transportation is, I actually love when I go to a hotel, I check in, they took my cell phone number and I get the text. I don't know if it's a person or a chatbot, but they ask me if I need towels or whatever, and I say yes, and I come back to the room and they're there. So whether or not that was a chatbot agent that ultimately sent some message to housekeeping to bring me my towels when I said yes, I'm assuming it was. Yep.
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, this is something I have with my clients, I'm just curious if you've seen this same thing, but when we talk about media and combining it, and it can get really, really complicated, especially if you're talking about anywhere from 12 to 16 modules, let's say for one piece that's going to be delivered from a client. QA has been a big issue with our clients, and understanding that they are not going to see every iteration of those content pieces coming together. And I know just from my agency that we QA, we're clear based off of the queries that run the business rules that are applied to the content pieces. But the client's not seeing that. So they're used to seeing an email that is an email. I'm just curious if you have the same issue, how do you tackle it?
We do have the same issue. Yeah, it's tough. I think like in healthcare specifically, I don't see a way around that right now. With like regulatory and compliance, like we just have to put everything has to go through. So yeah, it's kind of, I mean, I would urge, I'm assuming you're trying these things, you know, on a small scale first, and then, yeah, so I think the risk there is relatively low, but there's gonna be some risk in all of this stuff.
And I think that's why I'm asking, because at first it's like, well, no, it's fine. Yes, we're doing it, the QA is there, and then I sit down and I think, and I'm like, wait a minute, like, it's still a process that we manually set.
Right.
We manually tackle it. How can I understand why there's frustration. So,
I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer that. It's like,
I'm just interested to see where that goes, I think,
Yeah.
as it continues to grow.
yeah, I mean, I think as long as the elements individually have been seen and blessed by everyone, hopefully every possible combination is okay. And
On that check, I'm interested to see how or if AI can be developed to provide that checks. How can we put something in front of the client that does meet the time insurance, that legally this offer's not going to go to your goal member versus your producing example.
right. No, that sounds like a good idea. You want like a TurboTax, like checklist kind of thing. I don't know of anything that does that right now.
Oh, one more question, sorry.
What's the most interesting, for each of you, what's the most interesting commercial application of AI that you know, that you like? What's your favorite?
You guys have like,
It should be an easy question.
There's so many.
It'd be in healthcare for me. I think that having worked for a few years, not in cancer specifically or anything like that, but the electronic health record is a massively unstructured piece of data that probably has the keys to solving most of the problems we see in modern medicine. And so being able to apply systems that can look at that and find patterns that would never be
So
found
that's a
otherwise.
challenge. I'm looking for something that's working.
No, I think we're starting to see it work. Yeah.
Using it in clinical trials.
Yeah, we see, for example, I think the one that gets me the most excited is the work that AI is doing in terms of reading and understanding like the hundreds of thousands of clinical trials that exist and being able to match you to a specific trial, which in the past, a doctor just wouldn't be able to go through and find the right match, but they can look at your own personal health records and figure out what the options are. So that, I agree, James, that's probably the most exciting. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think Betsy, Jodie, and James, thank you so much. It was really. We're thrilled that you were here to demystify AI for us. It's been a wonderful evening, and we thank you so much.